100 acres for just one night, widow. The wealthy cattle baron's drunken laughter echoed through the saloon as he slammed gold coins on the bar, his eyes fixed on the black woman standing defiantly in the doorway. The crowd sneered at the widow, seeing only desperation wrapped in mourning clothes, a woman destined for servitude or worse. They expected her to flee in shame or accept in desperation. But the cattle baron saw something different, a composure that intrigued him, an intelligence that shouldn't exist in their world. What he didn't know was that this widow possessed secrets about land, law, and his own ranch that could destroy everything he'd built. Her response would either validate their cruel assumptions or shatter the very foundations of power in their frontier town. Would she bow to their expectations, or would her hidden knowledge rewrite the rules entirely? Clara Belle knelt in the dust beside her withering corn stalks, her calloused hands gripping soil that refused to yield. The Montana Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the small farm that had once been her husband's pride. Thomas had been dead 3 months now, and the land seemed to be dying with him. She wiped sweat from her brow and stood slowly, her black dress faded from countless washings. The creditors would come again tomorrow. 2 weeks remained before they seized everything Thomas had worked to build. Every night she heard the whispers from town drifting on the wind. The widow should know her place. She should find work scrubbing floors or washing clothes. Farming was no occupation for someone like her. Clara walked to the small wooden house and retrieved a leather-bound journal from beneath loose floorboards. Thomas had filled it with careful notes about crop rotation, soil management, and livestock breeding. He had learned these techniques during his time as a Union Army quartermaster, managing supplies for thousands of soldiers. Now Clara studied every page, calculating yield improvements and profit margins in her head. The numbers told a story the townspeople refused to see. This land could prosper with the right knowledge. Thomas had known it. Now Clara knew it too. Saturday arrived with the harvest festival, and Clara loaded her wagon with what vegetables she could salvage. The main street of Copper Ridge bustled with farmers displaying their goods. Clara positioned her small cart near the general store and waited. Customers approached, examined her produce, then walked away without purchasing anything. Mrs. Henderson picked up a perfect squash, nodded approvingly, then set it down when she noticed Clara watching. A young mother let her children reach for Clara's apples before quickly pulling them away. The morning stretched on. Clara's cart remained full while neighboring stalls emptied. Mr. Jameson, the bank representative, appeared at her elbow like a vulture sensing weakness. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention from nearby townspeople. "Mrs. Bell, I trust you remember our conversation about the outstanding debt on your property." Clara kept her voice steady. 2 weeks, Mr. Jameson. You said I had 2 weeks. Indeed, $47.30. Plus interest, of course. His voice carried across the street, ensuring everyone heard. "I do hope you have a plan." The crowd gathered closer, hungry for drama. Clara felt their eyes measuring her desperation. She heard the whispered conversations about her inevitable fate. No respectable family would employ her as help. Too proud, they said. Too difficult. Jameson tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Clara surrounded by curious stares and knowing smirks. She began packing her unsold vegetables back into the wagon. Evening brought the festival's main event. The saloon doors stood wide open, spilling yellow light and raucous laughter onto the dusty street. Clara walked past, heading home to her empty house and overdue bills. "Well, well, if it isn't the farming widow." The voice boomed from the saloon entrance. Rhett Harlow emerged, his expensive boots and silver-buttoned vest marking him as the wealthiest man in 3 counties. His cattle ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, employing half the men in town. When Rhett Harlow spoke, people listened. He swayed slightly, whiskey evident in his confident grin. The crowd from inside the saloon followed him onto the street, sensing entertainment. "Heard you had some financial troubles, Mrs. Bell." Rhett's voice carried the lazy drawl of a man accustomed to getting his way. Terrible shame losing that little farm. Clara stopped walking but didn't turn around. She felt the weight of every eye in town focused on her back. "Tell you what," Rhett continued, his voice growing louder. "I'm feeling generous tonight. 100 acres of prime grazing land. Enough gold to last you years." He paused for dramatic effect. "All for just one night of your companionship." The crowd erupted in laughter and crude encouragement. Clara slowly turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The gathered townspeople expected her to flee in humiliation or perhaps lash out in desperate anger. Instead, Clara walked calmly toward Rhett Harlow. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. "Mr. Harlow," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed street, "you might be surprised what a widow knows about land and law." Rhett's grin faltered slightly. He hadn't expected composed defiance. Clara continued, her tone businesslike and precise. "I have a counter-proposal for you. I'll accept your offer, but not for one night. Give me 1 year to manage your ranch operations. If I increase your profits by 30%, you provide me with 200 acres and a partnership agreement." The crowd stood frozen. This wasn't the response anyone had anticipated. Rhett stared at her, his drunken confidence wavering. "You want to manage my ranch? Your books, your cattle operations, your crop planning, everything." Clara's voice never wavered. "Unless, of course, you're not confident in your own business." The challenge hung in the air. Rhett Harlow had never backed down from a wager, especially not in front of half the town. But something in Clara's steady gaze suggested she knew more than a desperate widow should know. From the crowd, Deputy Cartwright watched nervously, his hand unconsciously moving to the ledger book tucked inside his vest. If you are enjoying this story of how one woman's bold counteroffer will change a frontier town forever, don't forget to comment where you are tuning in from to show how this story can connect us across any distances, backgrounds, and hearts. Because what will happen in the next part in Copper Ridge will completely change everything these characters thought they knew about power, justice, and hidden secrets. Rhett Harlow's laughter died in his throat. The crowd held its breath, waiting for his response to Clara's audacious proposition. His reputation as the territory's shrewdest businessman hung in the balance. "You think you can manage a cattle operation?" Rhett's voice carried less certainty than before. Clara met his gaze without flinching. "I think you're about to find out." The whiskey in Rhett's system made the decision easier than it should have been. He extended his hand, and Clara shook it firmly. The deal was struck before either party fully understood what they had agreed to. 3 days later, Clara Bell stood in the main office of the Harlow Ranch with a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned. The ranch hands gathered outside, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Word had spread quickly about the unusual arrangement. Rhett appeared in the doorway, considerably more sober than he had been at the festival. "Boys, meet your new manager." The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife. Pete Morrison, the oldest ranch hand, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We're supposed to take orders from her." "You're supposed to do your jobs," Clara said before Rhett could respond. "Same as always." She walked to the large desk covered with ledger books and scattered papers. Her fingers traced the columns of numbers, already noting inconsistencies. The ranch employed 37 men, ran 2,000 head of cattle, and managed 3,000 acres of grazing land. The potential for profit was enormous. The problems became apparent within hours. Clara discovered discrepancies in the cattle counts immediately. The books showed 2,847 head of cattle, but the actual count came to 2,290. Either someone couldn't count or someone was stealing. Deputy Cartwright entered the office as Clara reviewed the ledgers. His badge caught the lamplight and his smile seemed forced. "Mrs. Bell, I hope you're settling in well. Mr. Harlow asked me to help you understand how we do things here." Clara looked up from the numbers. "I'm beginning to understand perfectly." Cartwright's smile tightened. "These books can be confusing. Lots of moving parts in a ranch this size." Indeed, For instance, this entry shows the sale of 200 head of cattle in July, but there's no corresponding buyer listed. Clara's finger tapped the page. Who purchased them? I'd have to check my records. Sometimes we sell to traveling buyers who pay cash. Clara made a note in her own ledger. I'll need those records by tomorrow. Cartwright's jaw twitched almost imperceptibly. Of course. After he left, Clara continued her examination. The grain storage receipts didn't match the harvest reports. Feed purchases exceeded what the cattle population required. Money was flowing out of the ranch like water through a broken dam. But Clara had learned more than basic arithmetic during her years with Thomas. Her husband had served as quartermaster for the Union Army's Western Division, managing supplies and detecting fraud among military contractors. During long winter evenings, he had taught Clara the techniques he used to spot discrepancies and trace missing resources. She pulled out Thomas's old notebook, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. Methods for cross-referencing invoices, techniques for tracking inventory through multiple handlers, ways to identify patterns that revealed theft or incompetence. Clara worked through the night, applying Thomas's methods to the ranch's books. By morning, she had identified at least 12 suspicious transactions over the past 6 months. The next day brought her first test with the ranch hands. Clara gathered them in the main barn and outlined new procedures for cattle management. She explained rotation grazing techniques that would improve pasture health and increase weight gain. The men listened with barely concealed skepticism. These methods were developed by agricultural colleges and proven in military supply operations, Clara explained. They work, Pete Morrison crossed his arms. We've been running cattle just fine without college books. Your current methods waste 30% of available grazing and produce underweight cattle at market. Clara's voice remained calm and factual. We're going to change that. Some of the younger hands seemed intrigued by her confidence. Others appeared ready to walk off the job. Clara knew she had to prove herself quickly or lose their cooperation entirely. She spent the following weeks working alongside the men, demonstrating the techniques Thomas had taught her. The rotation grazing system required careful planning and execution, but the results became evident within a month. Cattle in the rotated sections showed improved health and faster weight gain. Clara also implemented Thomas's inventory management methods. Every head of cattle received individual tracking. Feed purchases were monitored against consumption rates. All sales required documentation with buyer verification. The improvements impressed even skeptical ranch hands, but the financial discrepancies continued to trouble Clara. Someone was still skimming money from ranch operations, and that someone had access to the books. Deputy Cartwright's promised records never materialized. When Clara pressed him for the documentation, he claimed the papers had been damaged in a recent storm. His explanations grew more elaborate and less believable with each inquiry. Clara began keeping her own secret ledger, documenting every suspicious transaction and unexplained shortage. She locked this information in a small safe Thomas had given her, hidden beneath floorboards in her new quarters. The ranch's productivity increased dramatically under Clara's management. Cattle mortality dropped by 15%. Feed costs decreased through better purchasing contracts. Grazing efficiency improved through systematic rotation. The numbers painted a clear picture of success, but Clara knew the stolen money remained a threat to everything she was building. Somewhere in the ranch's operations, someone was systematically stealing from Rhett Harlow. And that someone was becoming increasingly nervous about Clara's methodical approach to record-keeping. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Clara's business skills could overcome the corruption she had uncovered. 6 weeks into Clara's management, the Harlow Ranch showed profits that hadn't been seen in 3 years. The cattle were healthier, the grazing more efficient, and the books finally balanced. Clara had proven her worth to everyone except the man who had been stealing from the operation. Deputy Cartwright arrived at the ranch office on a gray October morning with 3 other men. His badge gleamed against his vest, and his expression carried the weight of official business. "Mrs. Bell, I'm afraid I have some serious accusations to address." Clara looked up from the ledgers spread across her desk. The numbers told a story of systematic theft spanning 2 years. She had finally assembled enough evidence to expose the scheme. "What accusations?" "Cattle theft. We have evidence that you've been selling ranch stock and keeping the profits." Cartwright placed a folder on her desk. "These documents show unauthorized sales totaling nearly $500. Clara opened the folder and examined the papers. The handwriting looked familiar, but the signatures were clearly forged. Someone had taken considerable time to create false evidence against her. "These documents are fabricated." "That's a serious charge, Mrs. Bell. Are you accusing a sworn deputy of falsifying evidence?" The other men shifted uncomfortably behind Cartwright. Clara recognized two of them as ranch hands who had opposed her management changes from the beginning. The third was a stranger wearing a territorial marshal's badge. "I'm stating a fact. These signatures don't match my handwriting, and these dates correspond to cattle sales I can account for through legitimate buyers." Cartwright's smile held no warmth. "The territorial office takes cattle theft very seriously, especially when it involves someone in a position of trust." Clara stood slowly, her mind racing through the implications. If these charges stuck, she would lose everything. Worse, she would be branded a criminal and likely face imprisonment. The racist assumptions of the community would be validated in their minds. "I want to speak with Mr. Harlow." "Mr. Harlow is the one who brought these irregularities to our attention. He's very disappointed in your betrayal of his trust." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Rhett had seemed supportive of her work, even impressed by the ranch's improved performance. Had he been planning this betrayal all along? "I have 48 hours to gather my own evidence before formal charges are filed," Clara said, remembering territorial law from Thomas's old legal books. "You have 24 hours, Cartwright corrected, "and you're confined to the ranch premises during that time." The marshal stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your personal quarters and any documents you might have." Clara's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "Of course." She led them to her small room, knowing they would find nothing incriminating there. Her real evidence remained hidden in Thomas's old safe, buried beneath the floorboards of her former home. The documents proving Cartwright's embezzlement were beyond their reach for now. After the men left, Clara sat alone in her quarters, facing the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The accusations would destroy her reputation permanently. No one would hire someone accused of cattle theft, especially someone the community already viewed with suspicion. But Clara had learned more than bookkeeping from Thomas. During his quartermaster service, he had taught her forensic accounting techniques used to catch military contractors who cheated the government. Fraud left traces in financial records, patterns that couldn't be hidden from someone who knew how to look. Clara spent the night analyzing every document in the ranch office. She cross-referenced cattle sales with buyer receipts. She compared feed purchases with consumption records. She traced every dollar through the complex web of ranch operations. By dawn, she had constructed an irrefutable case. The evidence showed that Deputy Cartwright had been systematically stealing from the ranch for over 2 years. He sold cattle to buyers in distant towns, keeping the profits and falsifying the records. He inflated feed costs and pocketed the difference. He even charged the ranch for supplies that were never delivered. The total theft exceeded $10,000, enough to bankrupt a smaller operation. Clara also discovered something else. The forged documents used to frame her contained details that only Cartwright could have known. The dates matched his duty schedules. The buyer names came from his old arrest records. He had been sloppy in his desperation to shift blame away from himself. When Cartwright arrived the next morning to arrest her, Clara was ready. "Before you proceed with those charges, Deputy, I think Mr. Harlow should see this." She handed him a thick folder containing her analysis. Cartwright's face went pale as he flipped through the pages. The evidence was methodical, detailed, and completely damning. This is all speculation and coincidence. The territorial marshal can determine that, along with the bank records I've requested from 3 neighboring towns. Records that will show deposits matching your stolen cattle sales. Cartwright's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. Too many witnesses surrounded them. The other ranch hands had gathered to watch Clara's arrest, but now they sensed something had changed. You're still facing charges for theft, based on forged documents that contain your handwriting patterns. Documents I can prove you created. Clara's voice carried the calm authority she had learned from Thomas. The question is whether you want to face charges for embezzlement alone, or embezzlement and falsifying evidence against an innocent person. The standoff lasted several long seconds. Then Cartwright turned and walked toward his horse. Clara called after him, "Deputy Cartwright, you'll want to stay in the territory. The marshal will have questions for you." The man who had tried to destroy her reputation rode away in disgrace, leaving Clara standing victorious in the morning sun. The arrest of Deputy Cartwright sent shockwaves through Copper Ridge. Clara had not only cleared her name, but exposed corruption that reached into the territorial government. Rhett Harlow publicly apologized for doubting her, admitting he had been manipulated by Cartwright's false evidence. But Clara's vindication brought unexpected consequences. Word spread that she possessed skills in detecting financial fraud and managing complex operations. Other ranch owners began asking for her advice. The territorial marshal requested her help investigating similar cases of embezzlement. Clara accepted these requests cautiously, using her growing reputation to build connections throughout the territory. Each case she solved revealed patterns of corruption that troubled her deeply. Someone was systematically cheating honest ranchers and farmers, and the thefts followed similar methods across multiple counties. 3 days after Cartwright's disgrace, Clara returned to her former home to retrieve personal belongings. The small farmhouse stood empty, exactly as she had left it months earlier. Weeds had overgrown Thomas's vegetable garden, and the front porch sagged under neglected repairs. Clara walked to the bedroom and pried up the loose floorboards where Thomas had hidden his most important possessions. Beneath the wooden planks lay a metal strongbox she hadn't opened since his death. Thomas had told her it contained papers from his military service, nothing of immediate importance. Now Clara wondered what else might be hidden there. The box opened with Thomas's old key, revealing documents that took Clara's breath away. At the top lay an official certificate from the United States Land Office, dated 1862. The paper bore Thomas's name and described a homestead claim for 160 acres of prime Montana Territory land. Clara's hands trembled as she read the legal description. The boundaries matched exactly with a section of the Harlow Ranch where she now worked. This was the land Rhett had offered her as payment for one night, then promised as reward for successful ranch management. But according to this document, the land already belonged to Thomas Bell. Clara found more papers beneath the homestead certificate, letters from the Territorial Land Office, stamped with official seals, survey maps drawn in Thomas's careful handwriting, receipts for filing fees and administrative costs. The evidence painted a clear picture of legal homestead claim that had been properly filed and paid for. At the bottom of the box lay a letter addressed to Thomas, dated just weeks before his death. Clara opened it with shaking fingers. The letter came from a territorial attorney in Helena, responding to Thomas's inquiry about his homestead claim. The attorney explained that Thomas's application had been deliberately buried by corrupt officials in the land office. Claims from applicants of Thomas's background were routinely denied or ignored, their lands redistributed to wealthier settlers with political connections. The attorney offered to pursue legal action, but warned that such cases faced enormous challenges. The territorial government had little interest in correcting past injustices, especially those involving property rights. Thomas had died before receiving this letter. Clara sat on the dusty floor of her former home, surrounded by documents that changed everything she thought she knew about her situation. She wasn't a desperate widow accepting charity from Rhett Harlow. She was the rightful owner of valuable ranch land that had been stolen through government corruption. The implications staggered her. For over 8 years, she and Thomas had struggled on marginal farmland, while their legally owned property generated profits for someone else. Thomas had died believing himself a failure, never knowing that systematic discrimination had robbed him of his rightful success. Clara gathered the documents and returned to the Harlow Ranch with her mind racing. She needed legal advice, but finding an attorney willing to challenge the territorial government would be difficult. Most lawyers depended on government contracts and political connections for their livelihood. That evening, Clara studied the documents by lamplight in her ranch quarters. The homestead claim appeared ironclad. Thomas had followed every required procedure and paid all necessary fees. The land office had accepted his application and issued a receipt. Under federal homestead law, he should have received title to the property within 5 years. Instead, the land had been quietly transferred to a series of shell companies before eventually ending up in Rhett Harlow's possession. The paper trail suggested a deliberate scheme to steal homestead claims and resell them to wealthy buyers. Clara realized this wasn't an isolated case. If the territorial government was systematically stealing homestead claims, dozens or even hundreds of families might be victims of the same fraud. The scope of the corruption dwarfed even Cartwright's embezzlement scheme. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Judge Harrison Webb arrived at the ranch in an official territorial carriage, requesting a private meeting with Clara. She had heard of Webb's reputation as one of the few honest officials in the territorial government. "Mrs. Bell, I've been following your recent work exposing financial irregularities. Your methods are quite impressive. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm hoping you might assist with a broader investigation. We have reason to believe corruption in the Territorial Land Office goes far beyond Deputy Cartwright's activities." Clara felt her heart racing, but kept her expression neutral. What kind of corruption? Fraudulent land transfers, homestead claims that disappeared from official records. We need someone with your analytical skills to examine the documentation. Clara saw an opportunity that could change everything, not just for herself, but for every family that had been cheated by the corrupt system. "I'd be honored to help, Your Honor, but I should mention that I may have a personal interest in this investigation." Judge Webb raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Clara reached for Thomas's strongbox. "Because I believe my late husband was one of the victims." Judge Webb examined Thomas's homestead documents with the careful attention of a man who understood their significance. His weathered fingers traced the official seals and stamps, verifying their authenticity against his knowledge of territorial procedures. "These documents are legitimate. Your husband followed every legal requirement for homestead acquisition." Clara felt vindication and anger warring in her chest. Then why was his claim never processed? Because certain officials in the land office were operating an illegal scheme. They buried legitimate claims and resold the property to buyers who paid substantial bribes. The judge's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption spanning 3 territorial offices. Over 200 homestead claims had been fraudulently denied or ignored over the past decade. The stolen land had been consolidated and sold to wealthy ranchers and mining companies. "We're preparing a comprehensive legal case against the entire network. Your husband's documentation provides crucial evidence." Clara realized the magnitude of what Judge Webb was proposing. This wasn't just about recovering her family's stolen property. This was about exposing systematic injustice that had cheated hundreds of families out of their legal rights. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony in territorial court. Your analytical skills will help demonstrate the patterns of fraud, but I must warn you, this case will face enormous opposition." The corrupt officials had powerful allies throughout the territorial government. Wealthy landowners who benefited from the scheme would fight to preserve their illegal gains. Clara would become a target for people with significant resources and political influence. Judge Webb, I've been a target since the day I was born. This time I have the law on my side. The legal proceedings began 3 weeks later in the territorial capital of Helena. Clara traveled there with her strongbox of evidence and Thomas's military records proving his exemplary service to the United States government. The courtroom filled with spectators from across Montana territory. Other families who suspected they had been cheated brought their own documentation. Newspaper reporters traveled from distant cities to cover what had become known as the Homestead Justice case. Rhett Harlow surprised Clara by testifying on her behalf. He admitted that he had purchased his ranch lands through intermediaries who claimed clear title, but now understood that some of those titles were fraudulent. His testimony carried weight because it came from someone who had benefited from the corrupt system. Mrs. Bell has proven herself the most capable ranch manager I've ever encountered. If the law says this land belongs to her family, then the law should be upheld. Clara's own testimony methodically demonstrated how the fraud had operated. She presented financial records showing suspicious payments between land office officials and shell companies. She traced property transfers that bypassed normal legal procedures. She identified patterns that proved systematic rather than isolated corruption. The defense attorneys tried to discredit Clara's analysis and question her qualifications. They suggested that a woman without formal legal training couldn't possibly understand complex property law. They implied that her race made her testimony inherently unreliable. Judge Webb shut down these attacks firmly. Mrs. Bell's methods are based on standard accounting principles used by federal agencies. Her analysis is mathematically sound and legally relevant. The evidence proved overwhelming. Official records showed that Thomas Bell had rightfully claimed 160 acres of Montana Territory land under federal homestead law. Corrupt officials had illegally buried his claim and falsified transfer documents to steal his property. But the legal victory brought unexpected complications. Clara's 160 acres comprised some of the most valuable grazing land on the Harlow Ranch. Returning the property to her would significantly reduce Rhett's holdings and disrupt established cattle operations. Other families with similar claims could potentially break up large ranches throughout the territory. The economic implications worried some community leaders. If every fraudulent land transfer was reversed, the territory's entire property structure could collapse. Businesses and families who had purchased land in good faith might lose their investments. Clara found herself at the center of a controversy that extended far beyond her personal situation. Some people praised her courage in exposing corruption. Others blamed her for threatening economic stability. The pressure intensified when anonymous threats began appearing at her ranch quarters. Someone left warnings that she should drop her legal claims and accept a cash settlement instead. The messages grew more specific and menacing as the court case progressed. Rhett offered her protection, but Clara knew she couldn't hide from people determined to silence her. She had opened a legal battle that challenged the foundations of territorial power structure. Backing down now would abandon not just her own rights, but the rights of every family that had been similarly cheated. Judge Webb delivered his final ruling on a cold November morning. The courtroom packed with spectators who understood they were witnessing a historic moment. The evidence clearly demonstrates systematic fraud in the Territorial Land Office. The court finds that Thomas Bell's homestead claim was legally valid and improperly denied. The Bell family is entitled to immediate possession of the claimed property plus compensation for 8 years of illegal seizure. Clara felt tears she had held back for months finally escape. Thomas's sacrifice and her own struggle had finally been vindicated, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court orders a comprehensive review of all homestead claims processed through the Territorial Land Office over the past decade. Families with evidence of fraudulent denial may petition for similar relief. The ruling opened the door for hundreds of families to reclaim stolen property. Clara had not just won justice for herself, but created a legal precedent that could restore rights to an entire generation of cheated homesteaders. As she left the courthouse, Clara carried documents proving her ownership of 160 acres of prime Montana Territory land. She also carried the knowledge that her courage had changed the territorial legal system forever. 1 year after Rhett Harlow's drunken proposition in the Copper Ridge Saloon, Clara Bell stood on her own land watching the sunrise paint the Montana hills gold. The 160 acres stretched before her, legally hers through court judgment and 8 years of back compensation. But the transformation went far beyond property ownership. The Bell Harlow Ranch Partnership had become the most successful cattle operation in 3 territories. Clara's management techniques, combined with Rhett's resources and connections, produced profits that exceeded both their original projections. The integrated workforce of former skeptics now sought positions at other ranches, carrying Clara's methods throughout the region. Rhett approached across the pasture, his expensive boots replaced by practical work wear. The arrogant cattle baron who had once offered land for companionship now deferred to Clara's expertise on matters of business and operations. Morning reports show the eastern herd gained an average of 12 pounds per head this month. Your rotation system is exceeding all projections. Clara nodded, reviewing figures in her leather-bound ledger. The northern pastures will be ready for rotation next week. We should move the yearlings there before the weather changes. Their partnership had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Rhett provided capital and political connections, while Clara managed operations and strategy. The arrangement benefited both parties while creating a model that other ranchers were beginning to emulate throughout the territory. The legal precedent from Clara's case had triggered dozens of similar lawsuits. Families across Montana Territory were reclaiming homestead properties that had been stolen through government corruption. The economic disruption was significant but ultimately beneficial, breaking up monopolistic land holdings and creating opportunities for smaller farmers and ranchers. Clara had received requests to consult on homestead recovery cases from as far away as Colorado and Wyoming. Her analytical methods were being taught at agricultural colleges and used by federal investigators examining similar corruption in other territories. But the most satisfying changes were happening in Copper Ridge itself. The town that had once dismissed Clara as a desperate widow now recognized her as one of its most successful business leaders. The general store that had refused her produce now competed for contracts to supply the Bell Harlow Ranch. Families who had whispered about her inevitable failure now sought her advice on financial planning and agricultural techniques. Mrs. Henderson, who had once refused to purchase Clara's vegetables, now worked as the ranch's bookkeeper. Pete Morrison, the ranch hand who had questioned taking orders from Clara, had become her most trusted foreman. The transformation of attitudes reflected deeper changes in community understanding of capability and worth. The morning brought a familiar visitor. Judge Webb arrived in his official carriage, but his expression suggested social rather than legal business. "Mrs. Bell, I have a proposition that might interest you." Clara smiled at the echo of words that had changed her life a year earlier. "What kind of proposition, Your Honor?" "The territorial government is establishing a new Department of Agricultural Development. We need someone to head the division responsible for homestead verification and ranch management standards." The offer represented recognition that Clara's expertise had value beyond her own operations. The position would allow her to help other families avoid the discrimination and corruption that had nearly destroyed her own dreams. "It's an important position, but it would require relocating to Helena and leaving your ranch operations." Clara considered the offer carefully. The job would provide influence and the ability to help many families, but it would also mean abandoning the land she and Thomas had fought so hard to claim. "Judge Webb, I appreciate the offer, but I believe I can do more good right here." She gestured toward the thriving ranch operation surrounding them. This partnership proves that different backgrounds and perspectives create stronger businesses. Other communities need to see that model in action. The judge nodded with understanding. "Perhaps you're right. Change often spreads more effectively through example than through government mandate." After Judge Webb departed, Clara returned to her daily routine of reviewing operations and planning improvements. The ranch employed 43 people from diverse backgrounds, all working together toward common goals of productivity and profit. Rhett joined her in the main office as she completed the morning reports. Their business relationship had evolved into mutual respect built on demonstrated competence rather than assumptions about capability. "Clara, I've been thinking about expansion into the railroad shipping business. The territorial line will reach Copper Ridge within 2 years." Clara looked up from her calculations. "That's an interesting opportunity. Have you run preliminary cost projections? I was hoping you might help with that analysis." The conversation continued as they discussed logistics, financing, and market conditions. Their partnership had grown beyond the original one-year agreement into a permanent collaboration that benefited both parties. As evening approached, Clara walked to the small cemetery where Thomas was buried. She carried flowers from the garden she had planted near their original homestead, now restored and maintained as part of the expanded ranch operations. "We did it, Thomas. Not the way we planned, but we proved the land could prosper with the right knowledge and determination." The sunset painted the Montana sky in brilliant colors that reflected off the mountains surrounding the valley. Clara's 160 acres had grown to nearly 300 through the partnership with Rhett, but more importantly, the land was being used to its full potential. Clara returned to the ranch house as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but she faced them with confidence earned through struggle and validated by success. The widow who had once faced destitution now owned profitable land, employed dozens of families, and had changed territorial law for the better. Her counteroffer to Rhett Harlow's crude proposition had indeed stunned him, but the transformation extended far beyond one man's assumptions to encompass an entire community's understanding of justice and capability.